The laughter started before Calvin Brooks had even finished sliding the worn leather folder across the polished conference table. It wasn't loud at first, just a quiet exchange of amused glances between two executives who noticed the scuffed shoes beneath his pressed but aging suit and the frayed cuff he had carefully folded inward, as though dignity itself could hide the years life had taken from him. Calvin didn't react. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small folded note covered in uneven blue crayon, read it once with the faintest smile, and tucked it back beside his wallet before resting both hands calmly on the table. No one in the room knew the note had been written that morning by his 9-year-old son, and no one cared enough to ask. "Mr. Brooks," Patrick Sloan said while flipping through the resume with obvious disappointment, "you've been delivering warehouse shipments, taking temporary contracts, and working construction. This position oversees hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in compliance. Help me understand why we're even having this conversation." Before Calvin could answer, another executive leaned back with a polite smile that barely concealed her judgment. "Honestly, this feels more like charity than recruitment." A few restrained chuckles circled the room. Calvin met every pair of eyes without lowering his own. "I'm here because I believe I can do the job," he replied quietly. "Belief isn't a qualification," someone answered immediately. The words settled over the room with the cold certainty of a verdict. Patrick closed the resume halfway as though the interview had already ended. "There are candidates with MBAs from top schools waiting outside. You don't have recent executive experience, impressive corporate references, or even a stable employment history. Why should this company take a chance on you?" Calvin inhaled slowly before answering. "Because every responsibility I've ever accepted mattered to someone else's future." The sentence hung unanswered. One executive rolled her eyes. Another scribbled something on her evaluation sheet without looking up. At the far end of the table, 72-year-old board advisor Harold Green had remained silent since the meeting began. While everyone else watched Calvin, Harold's attention drifted toward the final page still tucked inside the folder. It had never been mentioned during introductions. It wasn't clipped to the resume. It looked older than everything else inside, its edges softened by years of careful handling. Harold reached forward almost absent-mindedly. "Before we finish," he said in a voice so measured that the room instinctively quieted, "would you mind if I looked at this document?" Calvin's expression changed for the first time. Not fear, not pride, something closer to reluctant acceptance. "I haven't shown that page to anyone in a very long time," he answered. Harold carefully unfolded the aging record, and the instant his eyes found the insignia printed across the top, every trace of color drained from his face. The old military document rested silently in Harold Green's hands, but before anyone could ask another question, the story stepped backward to the beginning of that morning, long before polished conference tables and quiet laughter had filled the air. Calvin Brooks had been awake before sunrise, as he always was. The apartment was small enough that every familiar sound mattered. The old coffee maker rattled twice before settling into its steady rhythm. The floor near the kitchen window creaked in exactly one place. The refrigerator hummed just loudly enough to remind him it was still working. Noah wandered into the kitchen wearing oversized socks and carrying the unfinished model airplane they had been building together for nearly 3 weeks. One wing still leaned slightly lower than the other. "I think it flies better this way," Noah announced with complete confidence. Calvin smiled without correcting him. "Maybe it does," he answered while placing 2 slices of toast on chipped plates that had survived 3 different apartments. Money had become something measured one grocery trip at a time, but breakfast remained a promise he refused to break. Noah noticed the carefully pressed navy suit hanging from the closet door. "Is today the big interview?" Calvin nodded. "The really big one?" "Another." "Not." Noah looked at him for a long moment before disappearing into his bedroom without another word. Calvin assumed the conversation was over until the boy returned carrying a folded piece of notebook paper decorated with blue stars and uneven handwriting. "Do not open it until you get nervous," Noah whispered. Calvin accepted it as though it were something priceless. He slipped it into his wallet instead of his briefcase. Why the wallet instead of the folder? Perhaps because some reminders belonged closer to the heart than any resume ever could. Before leaving, Calvin paused beside a narrow cabinet near the front door. Inside sat an old cardboard storage box sealed with fading military tape. He opened it only wide enough to remove a weathered envelope marked with government lettering. His fingers rested on it for several seconds before he quietly slid it into the back of his interview folder beneath ordinary employment records where no interviewer would be expected to notice it. Why bring something he never intended to discuss? Even Calvin himself seemed uncertain. Outside, gray clouds stretched across the Seattle skyline as light rain tapped against parked cars. During the bus ride downtown, other passengers stared at phones, coffee cups, and morning headlines. Calvin studied neither. Instead, he rehearsed answers that had nothing to do with military service and everything to do with responsibility, leadership, and rebuilding a life after loss. When the bus stopped beside Northbridge Industrial Systems, he stepped onto the sidewalk and noticed a young maintenance worker struggling to lift a heavy delivery cart over a damaged curb. Without hesitation, Calvin set down his own folder and helped steady the load until it rolled safely forward. The worker thanked him quickly before rushing inside. Calvin simply smiled and continued toward the front entrance, never realizing someone watching through the lobby windows had quietly taken notice of the small act. Minutes later, after checking in with reception, he was escorted toward the executive conference room. As he reached for the polished brass handle, two voices drifted through the partially closed door. "This next applicant has not worked in corporate leadership for years," one executive said. Another laughed softly before replying. "Then this should be quick." Calvin rested his hand on the handle, took one slow breath, and walked inside. The conference room door had barely closed behind Calvin before the first real test arrived. Patrick Sloan slid a thick binder across the table without warning. "One of our compliance managers called in sick this morning," he said. "A supplier shipment is sitting at our South Distribution Yard with conflicting inspection reports. We normally give this case to finalists as a written exercise, but perhaps you can tell us what you would do." Several executives exchanged amused looks. The file contained more than 200 pages of shipping records, maintenance logs, safety certifications, and delivery schedules. Calvin noticed something else almost immediately. A handwritten note attached to the front warned that delaying the shipment for even one day would cost the company nearly $300,000. Patrick folded his arms confidently. Most applicants answer within 5 minutes. Calvin quietly turned the pages instead of speaking. The room grew impatient. Elaine Whitmore glanced at the clock, clearly wondering whether this had become an unnecessary waste of everyone's morning. Then Calvin stopped at a maintenance report buried deep inside the binder. His finger rested on one line for only a second before he closed the file. "I would stop the shipment," he said. Patrick laughed. "Congratulations. You just cost the company $300,000. Calvin remained perfectly calm. "If I approve it and I am wrong, the cost will not be measured in dollars." Nobody answered immediately. Why would someone with no recent executive experience reject the obvious financial choice? Denise Holloway leaned forward. "You found a problem in less than 2 minutes?" Calvin nodded once. "The inspection signatures do not match the maintenance timeline. One document had to be completed before equipment repairs that happened 2 days later. Someone either copied the wrong record or approved equipment that had not actually passed." Inspection. The room became noticeably quieter. Elaine reached for the binder herself and began comparing dates. The smile slowly disappeared from her face. She could not yet prove Calvin was correct, but neither could she dismiss the possibility. If he was right, how had he spotted something experienced managers had overlooked? Patrick tried to recover control. "Lucky guess." Calvin simply answered, "Maybe." That single word somehow sounded less like confidence than restraint. At that moment, an assistant hurried into the room, carrying a leather portfolio. "Excuse me," she said nervously. "Someone left this in the lobby." She placed it beside Elaine. The executives barely looked up until Calvin quietly spoke. "It belongs to the gentleman who interviewed before me." Elaine looked surprised. "How do you know?" Calvin pointed toward the edge of the portfolio. "His daughter's school picture is tucked into the inside pocket." He checked it twice while waiting outside. The assistant offered to return it to reception, but Calvin stood instead. "If you do not mind, I can catch him before he leaves the building." Patrick frowned immediately. "If you walk out now, this interview is over." Calvin looked at the unopened elevator doors beyond the glass wall, then at the family photograph still resting inside the forgotten portfolio. Without arguing, he picked up the portfolio and walked toward the exit. As the door closed behind him, Harold Green lowered his eyes once more to the aging military document in Calvin's folder. Beneath the faded unit insignia, a handwritten authorization line carried a signature that made Harold's hands begin to tremble. The elevator doors were beginning to close when Calvin caught sight of a man in a charcoal suit rushing toward the revolving entrance with his phone pressed against his ear. Without raising his voice, Calvin called out, "Sir, I believe you left something behind." The man turned, confused at first, until he saw the leather portfolio. Relief flooded across his face. "I have been looking everywhere for that." He accepted it with both hands and immediately opened the inside pocket. The school photograph was still there. He closed his eyes for a brief second before thanking Calvin. "There are documents in here that cannot be replaced." Calvin simply nodded and wished him luck before walking back toward the executive floor. Every passing second made the opportunity feel farther away. Had he just sacrificed the interview his son had been counting on? When the conference room door opened again, silence greeted him instead of conversation. Patrick Sloan did not invite him to sit down. "We appreciate your honesty," he said flatly, "but we also value commitment. Walking out during a final interview tells us where your priorities are." Calvin answered without hesitation. "Returning something that belongs to another father was one of my priorities." Nobody responded. Denise Holloway shook her head as if the explanation only confirmed what she already believed. Business requires difficult decisions. Sentiment does not keep companies running. Elaine Whitmore studied Calvin more carefully than before. She still questioned whether he belonged in the room, yet his choices no longer matched the assumptions she had made the moment he walked through the door. If he truly lacked executive judgment, why had every decision he made seemed guided by responsibility instead of convenience? Before anyone could continue, the assistant returned carrying a tablet. "The distribution yard just confirmed the shipment has been stopped." Patrick frowned. "Who authorized that?" "Operations did after reviewing the inspection discrepancy mentioned during this interview. They found additional documentation that may support the concern." The room shifted uneasily. Calvin did not smile or look vindicated. He remained as still as before, almost uncomfortable that events were unfolding in his favor. Elaine looked from the tablet back to Calvin. "If your observation proves correct, you may have prevented a serious compliance failure." Patrick immediately interrupted. "Or he guessed correctly once. One coincidence does not qualify someone for executive leadership." Harold Green remained unusually quiet. His attention never left the aging military record lying beside him. He traced one faded notation with his finger as though trying to remember something buried decades in the past. Then he looked directly at Calvin. "Mr. Brooks," Harold asked gently, "why did you never mention this part of your background?" Calvin's expression hardened with quiet restraint. "Because I came here to be evaluated for who I am today, not for who I used to be." Harold nodded slowly, but before he could ask another question, the conference room phone rang. Elaine answered, listened for several seconds, and her expression changed completely. She covered the receiver and looked toward Calvin with visible disbelief. "The man whose portfolio you returned is waiting downstairs," she said softly. "He says he is a member of this company's board of directors, and he refuses to leave until he personally speaks with the applicant who returned something everyone else failed to notice." The conference room remained silent long after Elaine ended the call. Nobody expected the applicant who had nearly been dismissed minutes earlier to become the reason a member of the board of directors refused to leave the building. Patrick Sloan finally broke the silence. "That is a coincidence, nothing more." Calvin did not answer. He seemed almost uncomfortable that returning a forgotten portfolio had become the center of attention. Elaine noticed something she had missed earlier. Every compliment directed toward Calvin appeared to make him less interested in defending himself, not more. That reaction did not fit the image she had formed when she first saw his resume. A few minutes later, the board member entered the room carrying the same leather portfolio. He smiled warmly at Calvin before turning toward the executives. "Gentlemen and ladies, I owe this man more than a thank you." Inside this portfolio was the original proposal for tomorrow's acquisition vote, but that is not what mattered most. He slowly removed the small school photograph from the inner pocket. "My granddaughter gave me this before her first day of 4th grade. If I had lost everything else, I could replace the paperwork. I could never replace this." The room grew noticeably quieter. Denise lowered her eyes. Patrick shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The board member continued. Mr. Brooks never opened the portfolio. He never asked who I was. He never tried to earn favor by returning it. He simply saw another father about to lose something precious. Elaine glanced toward Calvin again. Was this humility genuine, or was he simply unusually disciplined? Before anyone spoke, Harold Green carefully slid the aging military record across the table toward the board member. Take a look at the unit designation. The older man adjusted his glasses and studied the faded document. His expression changed almost immediately. That cannot be right. He looked at Calvin with genuine surprise. You served with this command? Calvin answered quietly. For several years. No further explanation followed. Patrick leaned forward. If this document is so important, why was it buried underneath temporary job records? Calvin looked at the folder for a long moment before replying. Because the people I served with taught me that yesterday's uniform should never become today's introduction. The answer unsettled the room far more than any speech could have. Harold slowly turned another page. Several handwritten evaluation notes filled the margins, but portions of the document remained covered by an official privacy sleeve. Whatever lay beneath it had never been discussed. Elaine noticed Harold reading the same paragraph again and again. Is something wrong? She asked softly. Harold did not answer immediately. Instead, he traced a faded signature with one finger before looking directly at Calvin. Who gave you permission to keep this copy? Calvin hesitated for the first time since entering the building. Someone who told me I would only need it if the day ever came when character alone was no longer enough. The room fell completely silent. Harold carefully lifted the edge of the privacy sleeve just enough to reveal the first line hidden beneath it. His eyes widened, and before anyone else could see what was written there, he whispered almost to himself, I never imagined I would see this name again. Harold Green slowly removed the privacy sleeve from the final page, revealing not a medal citation or a list of decorations, but a formal command evaluation stamped with archival markings that almost never appeared outside military headquarters. Every executive leaned forward without realizing it. Harold read silently for several seconds before placing the document flat on the table so everyone could see one sentence highlighted by age rather than ink. It described how then Captain Calvin Brooks had been granted temporary authority far above his normal position after senior leadership became unavailable during a large civilian evacuation. There were no dramatic descriptions, no exaggerated language, only precise observations stating that he maintained order, protected hundreds of frightened families, preserved critical infrastructure, and completed the operation without losing accountability for a single person assigned to his command. The room that had questioned his leadership only minutes earlier suddenly found itself staring at written evidence of it. Denise quietly looked back at the resume. The years of temporary jobs no longer suggested failure. They now looked like chapters that had come after an extraordinary life nobody had bothered to ask about. Elaine understood something else as well. The calm way Calvin had analyzed the shipment records, returned the forgotten portfolio, and accepted criticism without becoming defensive had never been separate incidents. They were all expressions of the same disciplined character described in the evaluation. Patrick searched for another explanation. Military leadership and corporate leadership are not the same. Harold nodded. No, they are not. But integrity translates into every profession. Before anyone could respond, the assistant entered once more carrying a printed report from the operations division. The shipment Calvin had insisted should be delayed had undergone an emergency inspection. The maintenance records had indeed been inaccurate. The equipment required additional servicing before it could legally leave the facility. Elaine slowly lowered the report onto the table. $300,000 had almost become a far more expensive mistake. Calvin still showed no sign of satisfaction. Instead, he quietly asked, Is everyone at the distribution yard all right? The question caught the room completely off guard. He did not ask whether he had been proven correct. He wanted to know whether people were safe. Another assumption collapsed without anyone mentioning it aloud. The board member folded his granddaughter's photograph and slipped it carefully back into his portfolio. Character reveals itself when nobody believes they are being evaluated, he said softly. Patrick remained unconvinced. Then answer one question for us, Mr. Brooks. If your record is this remarkable, Why spend years working hourly jobs instead of pursuing executive positions? For the first time, Calvin did not answer immediately. His eyes drifted toward the folded note inside his wallet before returning to the faces around the table. Harold seemed to understand even before the words were spoken. Elaine sensed the silence carried far greater weight than any accomplishment written inside the military file. Whatever reason had redirected Calvin's entire life was clearly more personal than professional. After a long pause, Calvin finally drew a slow breath and said, "Because there was one promise I could not ask anyone else to keep." Every person in the room waited for him to explain, knowing that whatever came next would redefine not only the interview, but the man they thought they had already judged. Calvin looked around the conference room before answering, not because he was searching for the right words, but because he wanted every person who had judged him to understand that the truth belonged to someone beyond himself. "The promise was to my son," he said quietly. "After my wife passed away, I told him that no promotion, no title, and no amount of money would ever matter more than being there when he needed me." The room remained still. Suddenly, every gap in his employment history carried a different meaning. The temporary jobs had not been signs of failure. They had been the only positions flexible enough to let him leave work for school meetings, doctor appointments, and unexpected phone calls from a child learning to navigate life without his mother. Elaine lowered her eyes as the realization settled over her. She had spent years teaching managers to look beyond numbers, yet she had ignored the person sitting directly across from her. Patrick still searched for a reason to protect his earlier judgment. "Commitment to family is admirable," he said carefully, "but this position demands long hours, difficult travel, and constant availability." Calvin nodded without arguing. "Then you should hire someone who can honestly give you that." His answer surprised everyone. Instead of fighting for the opportunity, he appeared willing to walk away if accepting it meant breaking the promise that had guided every decision he had made for years. The board member watched the exchange with growing respect. "Most applicants tell us what we want to hear," he said. "You are the first one willing to lose the position rather than make a promise you might not keep." Before anyone could respond, Elaine's tablet vibrated with another operations update. The emergency inspection team had completed its review. Calvin's recommendation had prevented the company from approving equipment that would have required an expensive recall after delivery. Several executives quietly exchanged uneasy glances. The applicant they had nearly dismissed had already protected the company before receiving a single paycheck. Denise folded her evaluation sheet in half. The comments she had written only an hour earlier suddenly felt impossible to defend. Harold closed the military file with deliberate care. "Today we have witnessed 3 separate evaluations," he said. "The written record evaluated the officer he once was. The operations report evaluated the professional he still is. Everything else we have seen evaluated the man and father he chose to become." Nobody challenged him. Yet one obstacle still remained. Patrick slowly gathered every interview scorecard from the table. According to company policy, the hiring committee had already submitted preliminary recommendations before the unexpected discoveries changed the discussion. Several ratings had been marked too low to advance Calvin to the final decision. Elaine quietly reached for the stack, but stopped halfway. Company policy existed for a reason, and changing. The process after the fact would invite questions from the board itself. The room now faced a different test. Would they protect procedure, or would they admit they had judged the wrong man for the wrong reasons? Elaine finally looked directly at Calvin and took a slow breath before saying, "There is only one way to resolve this fairly, but once I make this decision, every person in this room will have to stand behind it." Elaine Whitmore slowly gathered the interview scorecards, looked at each signature, and then placed the entire stack in the center of the table without reading another line. "Those evaluations reflected first impressions," she said calmly. "They no longer reflect the facts." Patrick opened his mouth to object, but before he could speak, the board member stood. "Our hiring policy exists to identify the best leader available," he said. "If the process reveals that our assumptions were wrong, then the process has not failed. We have." No one challenged him. Harold Green quietly slid Calvin's military record back into its envelope and handed it across the table. "You carried this without using it as a shield," he said. "That tells me more than anything written inside." Calvin accepted the envelope and placed it back beneath the ordinary employment records exactly where it had been before. Elaine noticed the gesture immediately. Even now, after everyone in the room knew what the document represented, he still refused to let it define him. Another silence settled over the conference room, but this time it felt entirely different. Denise slowly folded her notebook closed. "Mr. Brooks," she said, meeting his eyes for the first time without judgment. "Earlier today, I believed your resume represented limitations. Now I realize it represented sacrifices. I was wrong." Patrick remained seated, staring at the compliance report that had already confirmed Calvin's decision had protected the company. Finally, he exhaled and spoke with visible reluctance. "I judged your appearance before I evaluated your character. That is not the standard I expect from others, and it should not have been mine." Calvin simply nodded. He offered neither triumph nor criticism. His quiet acceptance somehow made every apology feel even more sincere. Elaine reached into her folder and removed a blank offer letter. Instead of sliding it across the table immediately, she asked one final question. "If we redesigned this position around measurable results instead of unnecessary hours, allowing flexibility when your family truly needs you, would you consider leading this division?" Calvin looked down at the folded note resting inside his wallet. He opened it once more beneath the table, reading the uneven handwriting that said, "You are already my hero." A faint smile crossed his face before he carefully folded it again. "I would consider any opportunity that allows me to keep my word," he answered. The board member smiled. "That is exactly the answer we hoped for." Elaine signed the offer letter first. Harold signed as a witness. The board member added his signature beneath theirs. For the first time that morning, the room did not see a struggling applicant sitting across the table. They saw the leader who had been quietly demonstrating his values from the moment he walked through the front door. Calvin accepted the letter with steady hands, thanked everyone for the opportunity, and rose from his chair without celebration. As he reached the conference room door, his phone vibrated softly. The screen displayed only one word: "Noah." Calvin smiled before answering, completely unaware that the simple conversation about to begin would become the moment everyone in the room remembered long after the interview itself had ended. Calvin answered the phone before he had taken his second step into the hallway. "Hey, buddy." Noah's excited voice came through immediately. "Did you remember to open my note when you got nervous?" Calvin smiled as he rested one hand against the quiet wall outside the conference room. "I did." Noah laughed. "I knew you would." There was no question about the interview. No question about money. No question about whether his father had been chosen. The only thing that mattered to the little boy was whether the note had done its job. Calvin closed his eyes for a moment. It helped more than you can imagine. After promising he would be home in time to finish their model airplane that evening, he ended the call and slipped the folded paper back into his wallet. Behind him, the conference room door opened. Elaine stepped into the hallway carrying the signed offer letter. "One more thing," she said. "If you accept, I would like your first recommendation as our new operations compliance manager." Calvin looked at her with quiet curiosity. "Change the first interview question," he replied. Elaine raised an eyebrow. Calvin continued, "Instead of asking applicants why they deserve the job, ask them to tell you about a promise they have never broken. You will learn more in 5 minutes than you will from 10 pages of credentials." Elaine did not answer immediately. She simply nodded and folded the suggestion into her notebook. Weeks later, the hiring process at Northbridge changed. Technical skills still mattered, experience still mattered, but every finalist was asked a question about responsibility before discussing achievements. Harold Green smiled the first time he watched the new interviews. He quietly told the board member, "The right leader improved this company before his first official day." On Calvin's first afternoon in his new office, he found a small package waiting on his desk. Inside was the model airplane Noah had been building, carefully repaired by the maintenance worker Calvin had helped outside the building that rainy morning. Attached was a handwritten note that read, "Thank you for noticing me when nobody else did." Calvin looked through the office window toward the busy parking lot below. He realized that every decision made that day had been connected in ways no one could have predicted. Returning a stranger's portfolio, stopping an unsafe shipment, carrying an old military record without displaying it, and keeping a promise to his son had never been separate moments. They had all grown from the same quiet choice to value people before appearances. That evening, Calvin arrived home before sunset, just as he had promised. Noah raced across the small front yard, carrying 2 tiny paintbrushes. Together they attached the final wing to the airplane, and this time it sat perfectly level. Noah held it up proudly. Now it is ready to fly. Calvin smiled, knowing the words meant far more than the toy in his son's hands. Some victories were measured in titles, others in trust, but the ones remembered longest were usually the promises kept when nobody was watching. Thank you for watching until the end of the video.